The Craigheads historically were Presbyterian ministers, farmers, and merchants. Most generations had sons that were, well, at least two of those. Not all the sons were ministers, but often they had one or two of them as ministers and the others as either farmers or merchants. The men, of course, living out in rural areas, tended to be hunters and fishermen like their neighbors and friends. But none of them were what you would consider naturalists until 1902. Actually, it probably started before 1902, but the first documentation of a Craighead working as a naturalist occurred in 1902. Agnes Craighead had took in students from the Carlisle Indian School on their outing program. Indian school students would go out into the country for a couple of months at a time each year to live and work with a family or with a business, in this case with a family. And Agnes had these very manicured flower gardens in the yard. She would get Indian school students to come out and help her tend those gardens, and they would make some money while doing it. Jean Craighead George, Agnes's granddaughter, said that her mother described the soil in these flower gardens as having the texture of coffee grounds, that they were that meticulously tended to. One Sunday in 1902, the teacher came out from the Indian school to check on how Emily Strong was doing. She was a student that was working there at the Craighead House. At that meeting, Frank Craighead agreed to help supply natural objects for the terrarium this teacher was building in her classroom there at the Indian School. And that was printed in the Carlisle Indian School newspaper. So that's the first documentation of a Craighead working as a naturalist. A couple years later, when Frank was in high school, he was exploring the South Mountain when he ran into some men who were working for the state of Pennsylvania for their entomology bureau, which was just in its earliest days. They asked Frank about where they could locate some particular thing that they were interested in finding, and he took them to that. He struck up a relationship with them, and on weekends when he was in high school, he would go into their office in Harrisburg and help build their collections. When the history of the Bureau of Entomology was written in the 70s, Frank received a larger write-up than did many of the men who were actually working there for pay when he was just a high school boy doing it for volunteer work. Frank, as did his two brothers, went to Penn State. He got a degree in biology, got a job in Washington, D.C. with the Department of Agriculture as an entomologist in their forest division. He went to school at night, got a PhD from George Washington University, and rose to the head of of his bureau and became the chief forest entomologist for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Frank had a lot of influence on his brothers, children's, nieces, nephews, and from him, the bent of Craigheads to become naturalists started. 1932, Frank Jr. and John Craighead, Frank's twin sons, were 15 years old. They met an aviator down in Washington, D.C., a lieutenant in the Army Air Corps, who was also involved in falconry. At that time, there were 4 men in America that were pursuing the sport of falconry to some degree. That was it. It was a sport that was basically not practiced in the country, basically unheard of by most people. They got interested in it and went to libraries, started researching old books and also biology books to look at what kind of birds they thought would make good falcons. They decided that a Cooper's hawk would make a good falcon based on the shape of its wings and other factors. Because their father was such a good scientist, he taught his children the scientific method. So the boys logged everything they did involved in the training of the falcons. And they were training themselves as well. It was very much trial and error because there weren't really experts around to ask about it, just some ancient books and an old National Geographic article. But little by little, they became expert at it. They kept all these notes and they took lots of photographs. Before 1937, they had put together an article about their experiences training the Cooper's hawks and other birds that follow, other hawks and owls that followed after they had completed training the Cooper's hawks. They wrote this article, knocked on the door of National Geographic, and surprisingly, it was published in the July 1937 issue of National Geographic magazine. That article got the attention of lots of people, not just in this country, but also around the world. They continued working with falcons, and in 1939 published a book, Hawks in the Hand, that was used as sort of a Bible by people, by what do you want to call them, budding falconists around the country. That book alone, plus later, Jean, their younger sister, Jean Craighead George, wrote a book titled My Side of the Mountain, in which her protagonist became a falconer. Those two books are credited with interesting almost any person in the country who's interested in falconry in the sport. When their 1937 National Geographic article was published, it got the attention of an Indian Raja, a prince, who wrote them after seeing the article and invited them to come and visit him. He said something to the effect, he says, I only have 36 birds and men. Like each of his hawks had a man to train it and work with it. And he invited them to come and visit him in India. And the twins responded, well, we don't have any money, we can't do that. Why don't you come and visit us? Well, the prince did. His familiar name was Bapa. His proper name is about a mile long, but the twins always called him Bapa. He came to visit the twins in America. They brought him up to Craighead. At Craighead, he slept out on the sleeping porch with the rest of the boys. The twins' mother informed them that Bapa could not bring any servants with him because she didn't have room to put them up. So Bapa had to come on his alone without servants, which was a very different manner of living for him. There at the Craighead House, on the walls that the family members and friends have painted, he painted his coat of arms, and the coat of arms is still there today. After finishing their master's degree at Michigan in 1940, the twins arranged a trip to India, funded by National Geographic. The trip lasted about 8 months. They sailed out of Seattle, went not on a luxury ship at all. One might consider it a tramp steamer, but eventually ended up in India. While in India, they lived the life of princes. National Geographic gave them a lot of color photo stock, both still and moving pictures. They documented their trip to India, wrote a National Geographic article about it, and there's, in more recent years, been a book published with all those color photos in it. The return happened a little earlier than originally anticipated because of the outbreak of World War II, and because of the Japanese actions in the Pacific. They couldn't come back the way they came. They caught a ship coming the other way and came back through New York and got back a few months before the U.S. entered the war. The twins were inventive. First, doing their photography, they're always having to make various things for their blinds and to put the mounts for their cameras, that sort of thing. And with the hawks themselves, their first hawk, the Cooper's hawk named Comet, was constantly breaking his tail feathers off. They learned how to, what they call imp-in feathers. They take feathers from other birds and glue them onto the stubs from his broken feathers. When they were in grad school, working their PhDs at Michigan, a photograph was taken of them, their wives, and their newborn children at Michigan Stadium, commonly called the Big House. And their babies were in these backpacks that the Craigheads made. So I guess so they could carry them like papooses, sort of. I thought the backpacks were interesting, but didn't take much note of it until I saw that Johnson Coyle had one. I asked him where he got it. He said, well, Frank Craighead made it for him. When I talked to John Craighead's son, Johnny said they made bunches of them. They still had wood, splints? Slats, wood slats from making them. And I asked him where they got the canvas for these backpacks. And he said, oh, they came from Maslin's. Well, Maslin's is a local carpet manufacturer here in Carlisle. So I asked Dave Maslin about it, because his father and older brother ran that business. And Dave said, well, during the war, there were no automobiles manufactured, so there's no market for automobile carpeting. So Maslin's Carpet shifted over to making canvas duck, and soon became the country's, if not the world's, largest producer of canvas duck. They made tents and jackets, all sorts of things out of this duck. And when I asked Johnny Craighead about it, he said, yeah, all their tents came from Maslin's. So these backpacks are a very local product. Frank Jr. and a man named Hoke Franciscus were friends. Hoke worked for Cronenberg's Menswear, but he was a ham radio enthusiast. Together, they put their heads together when Frank and John were in the early phases of their grizzly bear project. One of the problems with grizzly bears is that they travel pretty fast and far. So monitoring the grizzly bear's movements was extremely difficult. But Frank John Jr. and Hoke Franciscus came up with the concept of radio tracking their whereabouts, which required making a transmitter and a receiver. Frank and Hoke rigged up a transmitter, put it attached to this collar, and when the next summer, when Frank and John were out in Yellowstone again, they would anesthetize the grizzly bears, strap these collars with radios on them to them, and then monitor their whereabouts. They thus pioneered the radio telemetry of large mammals. No one had done that before. Their sister, Jean, their younger sister, Jean, often felt kind of left out because the twins had each other, where she was the only other child. And she said that one of the things she could do by herself was writing, because writing is a solitary undertaking. She had the bedroom in the upstairs of the house at Craighead that had the window overlooking the creek. She took a vanity when she was about 12 years old and painted it and used it as a writing desk. And she could sit there, look out over the creek, and write about whatever she was thinking about. Eventually, she became a professional writer. Later on, she and her husband started writing books together. and her husband was a biologist. So their books were about nature. There were people in nature, and sometimes just the animals by themselves. Eventually, she wrote a book called My Side of the Mountain that was a Newbery Honor winner, and it's been a quite popular book, still read today. And later on, she wrote Julia of the Wolves, which was a Newbery Medal winner. Overall, she wrote over 100 books, some of which hadn't been published at the time of her death in 2012. In fact, earlier this year, 2 more titles that she'd written were published through the efforts of her children.